Hello, good morning. This is Sir Dave, and today we're gonna discuss consumer surplus. So in this session, and we're gonna discuss welfare economics. So at least a part of the welfare economics. Kung first time nyo marinig yung welfare economics, this is actually the study of how the allocation of resources affect economic well-being. So mapag-uusapan natin dito, mapag-aaralan natin at malalaman natin how amazing market is when it comes to distributing benefit and making itself efficient in the economy. So makikita natin kung paano din nagbe-benefit si seller and buyers as they take part or as they participate in the market. So we're gonna examine how society can make these benefits as large as possible as well. So as we do this, as we are analyzing this, it will lead to a profound conclusion that the equilibrium of supply and demand in the market maximizes the total benefits received by natin as the buyers or natin din kung tayo din ay mga producer or sellers in the economy. So but first, for us to better understand this, we're gonna concentrate in this session to consumers. We're gonna begin our study of welfare economics by looking at the benefits buyers receive from participating in a market. So, para mas maintindihan nyo ako, I want you to imagine this situation. Let's assume that as I am cleaning my apartment ngayon, may nakita akong isang antique na gamit. Okay? Yung antique na yon, since I'm not fascinated to antiques, na pag-desisyonan kong ibenta na lang kaysa itapon. Okay? And fortunately, I have 4 good friends who are interested to what I'm selling. So I have here my friend John, Paul, George, and Ringo. So each of them would like to own the antique that I'm selling, but there's a limit to the amount that each of them is willing to pay for it. And that limit, ang gatawag natin doon, is willingness to pay. So si John, willing gumastos ng 100,000 pesos for my antique. We also have this, my friend Paul, who's willing to pay 80,000. We have George, 70,000 pesos. And Ringo, who's willing to pay 50,000 pesos for my antique. Okay? Because I don't like antiques, no? Sabi nga, I've decided to sell it. But one way to do so is to hold an auction. So, papasubasta ko ngayon yung antique dito sa 4 na to. Okay? Sabi natin kanina, their limits, tawagin natin yung willingness to pay. And sabi ko kanina, for me to be able to sell my antique, I'm gonna begin the bidding at a low price, let's say 10,000 pesos. Okay? Because all of these 4 buyers, who are my friends, are willing to pay much more, the price rises quickly from 50,000 and the bidding stops when John bids 85,000 pesos. At this point, si Paul, si George, and si Ringo have dropped out of the bidding because they are unwilling to bid any more than 80,000 pesos. Hanggang dito lang sila. Pero since John, nagbid siya ng 85,000 pesos for my antique, nakuha niya ngayon yung antique ko. John pays me 85,000 pesos, so he gets the album. And bakit album? The antique. And we have to note that the antique has gone to the buyer who values the antique most highly. So what do I mean by that? Bakit ko sinabi na napunta yung antique ko dun sa tao na mas nagpapahalaga nun? In studying welfare economics, we have to take note na ang basihan kung para malaman kung paano ba or gaano ba pinapahalagahan ng isang buyer ang produkto in the market ay nakabase or directly related dun sa willingness to pay niya. Gaano kataas yung willingness to pay. So in this case, in this table, we can conclude na si John yung mas nagpapahalaga o yung pinaka-pinapahalagahan yung antique na binibenta ko as compared to Paul, George, and Ringo. Bakit? Kasi John is willing to pay 100,000 pesos. Diba? As compared to this three, mas mataas yung willing ibayad ni John for my antique, making him as the buyer who values my antique the most. And in that way, no, masasabi natin na the market become efficient kasi napunta yung produkto, which is the antique, dun sa tao na mas may kailangan nun. Okay, that is the very concept of that. So, the question is, sabi natin kanina, as buyers participate in the market, they receive benefit. Diba? So what benefit does John, who is my friend, receive from buying the antique? In a sense, si John has found a real bargain. Bakit? He's willing to pay 100,000 pesos for the antique but pays only 85,000 for it. So we say that si John receives consumer surplus of 15,000 pesos. Bakit ko nasabing 15,000 pesos? Bakit? Consumer surplus kasi is the amount, consumer surplus is the amount a buyer is willing to pay, willingness to pay, for a good minus the amount the buyer actually pays for it, the actual pay. So in this case, we have to substitute the willingness to pay of John is 100,000 pesos minus 85,000. It will give us 15,000 pesos. So the consumer surplus is 15,000 pesos. Consumer surplus is the consumer benefit, diba, in the market. Yun yung nakuha niya as he participated in the market. So 15,000 pesos yung consumer surplus. For you to compute that, you just have to determine the willingness to pay. Tapos ima-minus nyo yun si actual na pera na binayad niya, actual payment. And then kung ano yung magiging sagot, then that is your consumer surplus. Madali lang, di ba? Pero syempre, economists love graphs. We're gonna use the demand curve to measure consumer. So as you can see on the whiteboard, I have here on the left side your demand, hindi pa siya demand curve kasi wala pa, okay? Wala pang demand curve. Okay? Yung graph for and doon natin ipa-plot yung demand curve. And on the right side of the screen, you can see the demand schedule, pero meron lang nadagdag na column, huwag kayo masyadong malito, huwag niyo muna pansinin yan, I'm gonna discuss it later. May nadagdag lang na column kung sino yung buyer. Based on the situation kanina that I have discussed to you, diba, we can derive actually a demand schedule and create a graph based on the schedule derived from the situation that I've discussed. So let's first understand the demand schedule here. If the price of the antique that I was selling kanina is more than 100,000 pesos based on their willingness to pay nung apat kong tropa, walang bibili. So the quantity demanded is 0 if the price is 100,000 pesos. That is why the limit here that I've nanilagay ko dito is 100,000 pesos. If the price of the antique is 100,000 pesos, how much is the quantity demanded based on the situation? If the price is 100,000 pesos, isa lang yung willing magbayad, making the quantity demanded as 1, isa lang. So this is your point. The quantity demanded is 1. This is your in your x-axis, In your y-axis, we have the price, which is 100,000 pesos. So again, what if the price drops from 100,000 pesos to 80,000 pesos? And what will happen to the quantity demanded if the price decreases? It will increase. Tama? So ngayon, paano siya tataas? Sabi natin kanina, if 80,000 to, afford na ngayon ni Paul, yung isa ko pang kaibigan, yung antique. Making the quantity demanded for antique becomes 2. So dito ngayon yung point. So kailangan pantay yan para makita nyo siya mamaya ng maayos. Ayan, yun ngayon yung second nating point. Dalawa na yung quantity demanded. Bakit? Kasi si John and Paul can buy or willing to buy the antique if the price become 80,000 pesos. Eto, nag-price drop. From 100, bumaba to 80,000 pesos. So what if the price drops to 70,000 naman? Naging 70,000. Ngayon, si George, which is my friend, who is my friend as well, can now buy or can afford the antique that I'm selling, making the quantity demanded becomes 3. Madadagdagan, 3 na sila na pwedeng bumili nun, diba? So here is your, okay, bakit? Dapat itim para hindi kayo malito. Yan. So this is our third point. Bakit nandyan? Kasi 3 na sila na pwedeng bumili kapag ang presyo ay 70,000 pesos. So lastly, what if bumaba ulit siya papunta sa 50,000 pesos? If that is the case, then all of them can be able to afford the antique that I am selling, making the quantity demanded for my antique to increase from 3 to 4. Kasi 4 na sila. Si John, si George, si Paul, and si Ringo. Ito ngayon yung point natin. Okay? So, based on this points that I plotted here, we can now create a demand curve. Pero, hindi natin gagawin yung kagaya nung alam natin, yung pinag-aralan natin sa law of demand, na ganyan. Ang gagawin natin when we are studying consumer surplus, para mas maintindihan natin kung gaano kalaking consumer benefit na nakukuha ng mga consumers and buyers dito, iba yung style ng pag-graph. So, ganito ang gagawin natin. Guhit ka dito, and then, yung susunod, hindi ito pantay. Wait lang, burahin natin to. Kailangan pantay siya doon sa 80 para di tayo malito. Guguhit pa tayo ng isa pa ganyan. Di pantay. Di pantay. Again, we are creating this demand curve for us to measure yung consumer benefit. Hindi lang tayo gumawa ng demand curve just to show the demand curve, but for us to measure the consumer surplus. So, ganyan. Yan. Malalaman nyo mamaya kung bakit ganyan. It should be here. And then, I have here another, and this is your graph. This is your demand curve as you examine the consumer surplus. So, bago natin palakpakan yung itsura niyan, kahit hindi siya pantay-pantay, di ba? Titingnan natin kung paano ba natin ma-measure yung consumer surplus base dito. So, ngayon, paano natin malalaman? Sabi natin kanina, we have to remember that consumer surplus is the amount a buyer is willing to pay for a good minus the amount the buyer actually pays for it. Kunwari, willing ako bayarang 100, pero the market price is 80 pesos. Ima-minus mo yung 80 sa 100, it will give you 20, and that 20 pesos is the consumer surplus that you got by participating in the market. Okay? So, ngayon, in this case, if 100,000 pesos nag-price drop to 80, etong, ibahin natin yung kulay para mag-gets natin ng kaagad. Dito, etong square na to is your consumer surplus. Okay? Kapag naging 80,000 pesos na lang yung presyo ng antique, and si John is willing to pay 100, eto ngayon yung consumer surplus na makukuha ni John. Okay? So, that is equal to 100 minus 80, it will give you 20. Okay? So, paano naman kung bumaba yung presyo from 100 to 70. So ngayon, kukunin ulit natin tong next na box. Ayan. Kung mapapansin nyo, dito sa unang square, 100 minus 70, it will give you 30. Tama? So from this, dito, sa shaded part na blue na to, 30 na yung consumer surplus. Pero kasi, si Paul na nadagdag sa eksena, di ba? Meron din siya makukuha na consumer surplus. Kung willing siyang magbayad ng 80, eto kasi yon 80,000 pesos, bumaba yung presyo to 70, meron siyang makukuha ang consumer surplus na 10. 80 minus 70 will give you 10. So in this case, kung 10 to, tapos dito ay 30, pag ang tanong, how much is the total consumer surplus? Okay, tandaan nyo, total consumer surplus, eto yon 30 plus 10, meaning, pinagsama-samang consumer surplus, benefit, pinagsama-samang benefit na na-receive nung mga buyers na nag-participate in the market. So in this case, si John and Paul receive a total surplus of 40. Nakuha? So, para mas makuha pa, let's take this another example. Pag bumaba naman yan to 50, eto ulit yung may mabubuo ulit tayo na consumer surplus. Again, para di kayo malito, ulitin ulit natin. When we say consumer surplus, it is the amount of buyer is willing to pay for a good minus the amount of buyer actually pays for it. So, let's examine the first part, yung kay John. Pag bumaba ng from 100 to 50, 100 minus 50, it will give you how much? 50 consumer surplus. That is for John only. Kay John muna. Nadagdag si Paul sa eksena. Si Paul is willing to pay 80 pero bumaba yung presyo to 50. So the consumer surplus here is 30. So si George naman, he's willing to pay 70. Bumaba yung presyo to 50. Nakakuha siya ngayon ng 20 na consumer surplus. Again, we're after the total consumer surplus or the total surplus that consumers got as they participate in the market. So 50 plus 30, that's 80, plus 20 will give us 100 consumer surplus. 100,000 pesos consumer surplus. So ano ang mapapansin nyo dito sa graph? So based on the graph, na-measure na natin yung total surplus and at the same time, nakita natin yung individual consumer surplus na makukuha ng mga kaibigan ko if or depende sa presyo, sa market price na isiset natin. So base dyan, meron pa tayong isang makukuha. We can derive something from this as well. Kung mapapansin nyo, as the price decreases, diba? Bumaba siya from 100 down to 50. As the price decreases, the total surplus, ibig sabihin yung lahat ng consumer benefit in the market increases. Okay? Habang bumababa yung presyo, the total surplus increases. Okay, habang bumababa yung presyo ng produkto na gusto nating bilhin, yung benefit na nakukuha ni consumer ay tumataas. So that ends our session for today. We just finished the very concept of consumer surplus. So I hope you've learned something today, and see you on my next video. We'll be talking about producer's surplus.